So friends, we started this last week. We're live doing the Facebook live stream. So greetings, friends who are joining us. Glad to have you here. I'm just going to awkwardly wave at you. And Ryan's back there. Hey! But friends, welcome. Last week we began a journey of changing the story of scarcity. We live in this wider story of cultural scarcity. And so how do we live differently into a story of abundance, the Jesus story? And how we're doing that is that each Sunday for these 4 weeks, we're naming a paradigm that will help lead us into a larger life, a more generous life, the kind of life that's shaped by then that love and life of Jesus. So with each paradigm, each week, we're considering the resources that we all have. What are those 3 resources? Time, talent, and treasure. Good job. Yeah. And we also talked about, you can also say it with C's, calendar, capacity, and cash. But just being mindful that we have these resources that we can use in our lives. And we're letting God do some work with us then in holding those 3 resources up against the particular paradigm, these mindsets each week, and asking God to really lead us into a more generous life. Which, this is just really easy stuff, right? No sweat. Got it. Yeah. So I am thankful that you're willing to do this courageous work with me, that we can do this work together. So in case you missed last week, our first paradigm, but even if you were here, it's always good to have a review. So we just have a little video clip taking some of the audio from last week and listening and looking at that. So this is a video to kind of catch us up from last week. Now, the fresh yes is important because even if we're someone who has always identified as Christian, even if we're considering it, if we've just stepped into it, we still live every day in this cultural story of scarcity. And it takes the intentional swimming against the current, right? Choosing a different story than the one that we're in order to stay in that story of Jesus. It takes intention, it takes awareness of recognizing the scarcity stuff as it's happening. And as Jesus said, all we need to do is ask to get what we need to live that story. So do we need to ask again today? And is there a particular place in our lives where we need that energy? So generous living flows from the Spirit of God as we say yes to the Jesus story together. But I snuck it in there as we keep saying yes to the Jesus story together. That it is a continual coming back to oh yeah, this is the story. This is the story. A generous Father, the Spirit of God that is available to fuel us to live beyond ourselves. So that's right, last weekend we named how generous lives are not marked by how much we can just be awesome and muster it. Okay, I'm gonna do this, but that generous living really flows from the Spirit of God. That is the source of what we're talking about here. And we looked at that passage from Acts chapter 2, this incredibly generous life that they lived together. We're how is that even possible? Oh, right, the Spirit of God. Okay, cool. So that's what we did together last week, that we just need to ask to access that Spirit that is available beyond ourselves. Again, good, hard stuff for us to keep living into. So this next week, to explore this second paradigm, the second mindset, to experience the larger generous life that God has called all of us to, I want to go to an internal memo that's there in our scriptures. So we're going to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. So there are 2 letters written to Timothy. This is the first, that's why it's the first Timothy, right? But again, this is sort of an internal memo. We've got 2 of these letters that Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote to Timothy, who was a pastor, someone who has a job that kind of looked similar to what I do. So Paul, being a veteran church pastor, he's telling Timothy, this younger, newer church pastor, how to lead Jesus people. So it's kind of like a playbook. Timothy is this pastor then in the city of Ephesus. And Ephesus, you can still go there today, right? It's in modern day Turkey. And today it looks a lot like this. But 2,000 years ago it was much more impressive, a lot less ruined. But a pretty impressive, prominent city of great diversity. So it's important to remember there's a lot of ethnic, cultural, economic diversity in the city. So Timothy is then leading a church within that context. People who had begun to follow Jesus along all points of those spectrums. So like a great diversity of folks. And as we read this, we're seeing really kind of behind the scenes principles that leaders used in these early gatherings in the early church. And so in this little paragraph that we're going to hear from 1 Timothy 6, Paul really zeroes on a principle that may seem a little weird to us. It may even seem a little crass that Paul would go this way, because Paul wants to tell Timothy how to lead rich people. Rich people. Notice then what Paul has to say in how rich people can live out their faith in this particular community. So we have 1 Timothy chapter 6, 17 through 19. Ready? All right. Command those who are rich in this present world, not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life, and I love this, may take hold of the life that is truly life. Did you get that? It's in your bulletin if you need to kind of put your eyes over it again. It's on the back of that insert. But again, Paul is addressing rich people. So like the upper crust, the top percentile. I want us to kind of consider our current world today. And I wonder who and what comes to mind when we think of rich people. I just want to shout things out like, who is rich? People, or like, what does that look like? I think of a lot of sequence, like that's someone who's rich. I don't know. So like, what does that look like? 1%. The top 1%? The 1%, yeah. What's that? Hollywood. Yep. Wall Street. Fancy cars. I think of like private jet stuff too. Like you're living on your own little island or something. I don't know. I think of Bill Gates, Taylor Swift. Anyone else?
Nouveau riche.
Who is it?
Nouveau riche.
Nouveau riche, yep. Oh, rich, a large, close-knit family of several generations. I like that. Well, I just kind of wanted us to get into that. Like, what does this look like for us now? Like, rich people, I think in our current context, like, we think of people who are famous, right? Like Hollywood, like people who are well-known, well-seen, people who have, I think, all the money and therefore all the time that they need, that they want to do whatever they want. Maybe even all the talent that they need, whether that's smarts on Wall Street, whether that's singing Taylor Swift, or like, so whatever that looks like. And maybe if you're like me, that sometimes, when we hear about people who are, maybe it's just me, when we hear about people who are rich, I kind of think to myself, man, if I had that kind of time and resources and talent, man, life is so easy for them. If I had that, I would do so much better. Do you ever get judgy with other people's resources? Anyone else? Is that just me? Okay. But this word, this label rich, is an interesting one for us to consider. And I want to try an illustration to unpack something about this. A friend of mine showed this to me, and you may have seen something like this. But I want to use a picture of pencils. So we have 10 pencils there. They're lined up side by side, and they represent the world's population by wealth. So spread across evenly in these 10 pencils, some 7.4 billion people. So the one on the farthest right, that's your right, kind of that golden, orangey, yellow pencil, farthest right, that represents the richest people in the world. Imagine just the wealthiest buckety bucks, Bill Gates, all those folks. They're on the furthest right. Then the pencil on the farthest left, as you might imagine then, those are the folks that have absolutely nothing. Like they don't have clean water today. They don't have enough food for today. And the spectrum just stretches between them, kind of dividing people up evenly in those 10 pencils. Now think for a moment, which pencil do you think you are? So pick one of those colors that you think is you. Well, although we would say that we're middle class, right? So maybe we're somewhere there in the middle. We don't end up in the middle. All of us in this room, all of our friends, including also, though, Taylor Swift, Bill Gates, we all occupy that pencil on the furthest right. That's all of us. The rest of the world, some 6.5 billion people, they live in those other 9 pencils. But we are the top 10%. People with cars, there are 8% of the world has cars. Anyone in this room have a car? Yeah. So when Paul writes this to Timothy, he has a certain category of people in mind. So in that context, in the first century in the Middle East, poverty was the norm. Poverty was the norm. So those who were rich then, by Paul and Timothy's understanding, they would be those who had more than enough food, more than enough clothing, and enough shelter for themselves and for their family if they had a family. So that is rich by their definition. So no private jet for them. And I was like, what would a private jet equivalent be in the first century? Or, like, what's that, like private camel? I don't know, like chariot, of course. That's good, I like that. What's that? Boat. Thank you, yeah, good, I like that. But just think about that. That really reorients the way in which we hear this, we read this text. For me, when I start reading this text and I read the words, command those who are rich, like in some ways I just like mentally check out. I'm like, no, that's not me. I'm like, that's not me. I'm not rich. I would never use that word to describe myself. Have you ever used that word to describe yourself? But the rich are those who have even just a little bit more than enough. And when we consider the pencils, you may have seen it in a different form or heard this before, but we are actually at least in the top 10% of the wealthiest people in the world. Paul was talking about us. We are rich. Don't get me wrong, I know some of us are struggling. I know some of us are steeped in debt. Some of us haven't had a job in a long time. Our graduates are like, what are you talking about? I need a job. Like I know, like some of us are very, very challenged. And yet, even in the midst of those very real challenges that we have, we're still in that top 10% of the world. So my question is, why? Why do we look at our resources through this lens of scarcity? Why is it so surprising to hear this word that we are rich? Why do we look through this lens? I know that I look through that lens of scarcity when it's not actually true. So why is that when we actually are folks who are rich? Where does that come from? Well, I want to spend a few minutes kind of exposing the sources and dynamics around that scarcity stuff. So I'm going to offer some reflections, but I really invite you to open yourself up to consider your own story, what has shaped you uniquely. So kind of pay attention to what might come up as we do this. So from what I can see, so here's what's attractive about the lens of scarcity. I derive a certain amount of comfort by looking at the world through that lens of scarcity. The lens of scarcity is so prevalent because there is such a wonderful security blanket for me to think that life is a depleting resource. And I need to take all that I can get. Because before it slips out of my fingers, I need to hold on to that. It keeps me self-centered. It keeps me feeling safe and protective. Gives me that posture. Keeps money in my own bank account. I wouldn't want to risk it. Keeps my calendar on my terms because there's only so much time. I don't want to waste any of that time. Maybe this resonates for you too. The perceived comfort that's there in that lens of scarcity. It feels good. I want to hold things close, right? And I wonder for you, for me, like where did that actually come from? Yes, it's in the wider culture, but where else did we pick that up from? I wonder about our families of origin, our experiences of growing up. That's a pretty good place. That's a common place where we pick things up, is in those families, the ways in which we were raised. What are some of the messages that you see from your family about money and generosity and scarcity? I find it helpful to try to think of like actual conversations or like things that were repeated in your family or the ways in which you did things together or not. I've been thinking of these in my own family. And for me, one dynamic of my own childhood that has shaped that lens around scarcity versus generosity is how fairness was handled in my family. So I have two brothers. I'm a middle child, so I have two brothers. And my mom did just like the supreme job of making things fair for us. It was like, make sure this is fair. And I was thinking of all the examples of this. Like we'd come home from school and there's 3 plates on the kitchen counter, 3 cookies on each, little glass of juice. Like dun, 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 all the same. She would like keep track for Christmas presents, the amount of money spent on each child. So it was like within a few dollars, of being exactly the same for each of the 3 children. And really like the quintessential thing for me was thinking of this little chart, this little schedule really that my mom kept. It was for the coveted black stool at our kitchen counter. Oh, so imagine if you would, our kitchen had 4 stools, 3 kind of plain, wooden, round, top, no cushion or anything, 3 stools, and then there was the black stool, which was like metal frame with like black vinyl top, like shiny black with like both a back on it and it even swiveled. I mean, this is like the stuff of childhood dreams, right? So it's like very coveted. We'd race to sit in the black stool. And so finally my mom just made this schedule. It was taped to the fridge, listed out the days of the week. And like, it was like for the month, it was like Sarah, Steve, David, Sarah, Steve, David. Just like it would rotate through whose day it was. And whoever happened to have that day in the black stool also got shotgun in the car because that is also highly coveted no matter what age you are, right? So thank you, Mom, for managing that. But again, the fairness thing. And I think, my mom it was very thoughtful. She did a wonderful job. And yet I have this fairness streak in me. Like, is that fair? Am I getting my share? And, what about me? So I just know that is in me because of the way in which I was raised. And it really has, life is a depleting resource. I need my share. Like, it needs to be fair. So that is me. But I wonder, what are your own experiences and memories and stories and practices from childhood? How has that shaped you? In what ways might you also kind of tap into that feeling that life is a depleting resource? Maybe when food was put on the table for dinner, it was like every person for themselves. If you didn't grab a piece of pizza, like immediately you'd be licking the cardboard. Like that would be dinner for you that night. It's like, if you snooze, you lose. It's like you need to grab hold of whatever that's there. Maybe it's the way in which your parents talked about their sense of self and self-esteem. They would say things like, try as hard as I can, but I'm never going to make it. There's ways in which we hear these messages early on, right? And we hold on to them. And they instill in us then this way in which we want to keep ourselves safe and secure, which is totally, totally, totally natural. But it keeps us in a very small life, because if life is a depleting resource, then by all means, take whatever you can, get whatever you can. When fear pings us, we get these messages like, oh, I'm going to need more money, more margin before I can share any of it. Messages of, I'm so busy, I don't have enough time, I can't consider helping out anyone else. The message of scarcity tells us that I'm just not talented enough. I'll never be as talented as that person. I can't really make a difference. I can't make an impact. So where does that message, that lens come from for you? So there is another category of people, another paradigm, another mindset that looks through life and our resources through this lens of abundance. So as we kind of start to understand this lens of scarcity, what is it about this lens of abundance? So the Jesus story argues that the messages of abundance are actually more true than the ones that fear would lead us to believe about scarcity. And people who look at life through the lens of abundance, what that looks like, they see things like, I already have something that someone needs. People who look at life through the lens of abundance say, I have just as much time in my day, and I can choose to maximize that for maximum impact. People who look through the lens of abundance say, I'm uniquely qualified because I'm the only one with my story. People who look through the lens of abundance see what they have, no matter how much or little it is today, and they can still say, I am rich. I am rich. So how do we actually live into that mindset? I'm like, that sounds awesome, right? But how do we actually live into that? Well, we named last week that thankfully it's fueled by the Holy Spirit. This is when we say yes to the story of Jesus, like that is just part of what is at work in us. That generous living isn't about what we can and can't do. It's the power of God that gives us that agency to choose and believe and live a different story. So in the midst of all of this then, though we hear Paul give Timothy actually some pretty practical advice on this. He says that this is what you should do. Timothy, to lead them into a larger life. The step here to free them from a paradigm that keeps their life contained, that keeps it small, that keeps it in that lens of scarcity. He says to Timothy, lead them to not value their lives based on what they have. Don't place value there, not to value their life on what they have. And I hear that, I go, well, yeah. I mean, and we all live in that place of struggling with that. Those things that we tell ourselves, I'm only what I make, I'm only what's in my bank account, I'm only how talented I am, I'm only how much time I think I have. And we've talked about that previously, the kinds of things that we tell ourselves about who we are and where value is really placed. So Paul says to Timothy, free them from finding that value there in what they have. He also says, free them from finding security there in what they have, which I think is a big piece of this scarcity piece. He says, don't find security there because what we have is so unpredictable. It could all be over tomorrow. Our talent could be taken from us due to injury. Great fortunes are lost in an instant. So why base our sense of security on something that's so evaporating, so unreliable? Rather, Paul says, rather than measuring ourselves by what we have, measure our life by what we have to offer. By what we have to offer. Paul says, he says it this way in our text as we read it. So, okay, what does this look like? It says to be rich in good deeds and to be generous and willing to share. And in doing this, in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. And that's not talking about life after I die, I'm going to heaven. It's not talking about that kind of grabbing hold of life. It is life in this lifetime on the earth as we know it now. And do we want to take hold of a life that is truly life? Yeah, I do. That sounds good to me. Paul says, then let it go. Be rich, not in money and resources and gathering, but in good deeds, in sharing. Another version of this text says, be extravagantly generous. And I love that. And this then is the big concept for today, the paradigm for us today, the thing to kind of hold up our time, treasure, and talent alongside of this mindset to a bigger, more generous life, is that people who share all they have actually get all they can. People who share all they have get all they can, or in other words, another way to say it is we only get what we give. So let me unpack this a little bit more. Paul says in this paragraph, do you want to know how to make God a part of your joy, responsible for your joy? How you can leverage God's resources for joy? He says, share. Do good things in the world and in the lives of others. Give. And don't do it out of a sense of shame or guilt, right? We said this last week. It's not like, well, I should be doing this. Guess I better do that. It's not guilt. It's not shame that motivates us, but it's because God has wired us for it. He's resourced us for it. We are each uniquely rich in ways that no one else is. Whether we think we've got a lot of resources or nothing at all, God has given us what we need to provide for someone else. And in some strange, miraculous way, the more that we try to keep and the more we try to hang on to it, the smaller our life gets, guaranteed. And really, we know this, right? We go, well, yeah. I mean, that's hard, but this is what we observe in the world. Those are the stories that draw us in. Whatever we believe about God and church and Jesus, we know this already, that true life, a larger life, is found in giving. And we see that. Those are our heroes, right? The best stories are the people who sacrificed for the sake of the other. Those are the people we admire. Something in us is drawn towards sacrifice and service and giving because that is that true life that Paul is describing here. And I noticed too in this that Paul doesn't say, like the approach for this is he's instructing Timothy, right? Okay, how to go about this. He does not say, All right, do a lot of teaching and praying to make sure you kind of first change their minds and their hearts so they feel okay about doing this. So they feel ready, so they feel like they're generous. They feel like, okay, now I feel generous, I'm ready to do this. It doesn't start with a change of mind, with feeling anything, feeling ready, feeling like we are rich. It starts by taking action. He says, tell them to do this. By calling up the friend, by saying yes to the chance to bring in your neighbor's mail, by cooking food for your church, by volunteering to serve on the board of directors, by buying food and supplies for the sheltered, by working towards giving away a full tithe of our income for the work that God is doing in the world, by taking action. That's how we grab hold of that life. And I think Paul knows that we will never really feel ready, convinced, able to have all the things in the right place, like, okay, now I have enough, now I'm ready to give. It simply begins by doing it. By naming that we are rich and that the Spirit of God is available to us beyond the point where we end, and just trying it. And I see that playing out in this community. Folks are so generous. Since the start, even before we started here at Salt House, people have been so generous with time and money and resources and baking communion bread. And Nancy, and you can hear her in the kitchen right now. People have been amazingly generous. And we keep doing that because we tap into this life that is truly life. But I also know that for some of us, this may be hard to kind of believe, to kind of let it sink in. So maybe I kind of have to believe this for some of us. But I believe that this is truly life. And that it is possible because each of us is made in the blueprint of a giver. Paul said it here. He says, God has given everything for our enjoyment. Generous Father, that's what we said last week too. God can't help but give. Did you know that? That God can't help but give and give and give. And when we decide to open up our lives and allow God to give through us, we don't lose anything, but we gain everything. We become more fully who we are meant to be. And I think that's why this works. I think Jesus showed us that the greatest life we can live, the greatest spiritual impact we can have in our community, in any community, at any time, is a life that's lived for somebody else. And we may start wondering, okay, wait, hang on, shouldn't there be, we can't just give everything away, right? I mean, you're not talking about everything, right? Shouldn't we have limits, boundaries around what we do and don't give? And the answer is yes, absolutely, of course. There are absolutely boundaries around how we engage in generosity. But you'll have to come back next week to hear about what that looks like. But as we finish this time together, I want to move us into a space where we really take time to listen to our stories. We started doing some of that, talking about the black stool. Hopefully some other things came up for you from your own stories. And again, because we want to pay attention to how we might change the lens that we look through. And we're going to do this by putting on a pair of perspectacles. You should have gotten, if not, we'll get one to you, a little piece of paper with some glasses, and it says perspectacles. Glennon Doyle of Monastery, if you're familiar with that blog or on Facebook, she made up this word. It's a mashup of perspective and spectacles. So it's a change, changes the way we see things, the way we look at the world. And in this case, it's a matter of choosing to put on the lenses that give us a fresh, true, real perspective on our resources and on our world. So as we think about our perspectacles, there's two ways to do this. So you have your little perspectacles, and I actually put in kind of two questions on the back of that bulletin. The first one is kind of long, but it gets at what we've been talking about, what are those messages, experiences, memories you have that have really shaped your attitudes, your lens around scarcity, how your parents were, those kinds of questions. Again, for me, I can name that fairness was a huge part of my family culture. It still is. We can name these things without judgment, right? This is about understanding our stories, understanding the stuff that we're living in and with. So we want to name those things which have formed us, because it helps us then understand the work that we can do to find truer messages. So then the second question invites us to name those new true messages that we want to own. The new lens, naming the perspectacles. So for me, what I would do with this, I would write around the edges, here's all the ways in which here are the messages I heard in my family, and then over the lenses, I'd write, here are the new ways in which I want to see this world. And for me, it's like, I am rich. Like I need to own that as my identity. And as I consider how I am with my children, and as I consider the clothes that I wear, and as I consider the resources that I have to give, like, I want to see myself through that lens, and that I have enough, that I don't, it's not about being fair, like letting that go. So that's my process for that. But what's yours? What phrases, ideas have kind of grabbed your attention or come to mind through this time? So we're going to shift into a song of response as we do. And I would invite you to kind of through this time of singing as well as into communion, let this just be a space where we really step into looking at the world differently. And it begins by naming it. So take that time to listen to God and to each other as we name this together.